January. Welcome to our January and the first. If everyone can mute themselves that's coming in, please. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our January 13th of the month event. So excited to have you all with us. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Julia to do our welcome.
Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing this lovely Friday? Thank you for joining us for Baltimore Racial Justice Action's 13th of the month event. Happy New Year, first of all. Welcome to 2023. And this is our first event of the new year. So next slide. So first, my name is Julia Scott, and I work with BRJA, usually with Michelle during our 13th of the month events. We're going to start with some virtual housekeeping. So for these events, especially online, we encourage everyone to use their voice, and we welcome participants to also use our chat box during discussions and question and answer times. We do ask that you mute yourself during the panel where we have a speaker speaking to minimize our audio feedback. And video is encouraged, but it is not required. We are recording our session, so we want to make sure that you all know that ahead of time. Next slide. We believe that this space is a part of our learning community. So we're really excited to have you here. And so what we mean by learning community is that you are more than just the audience. So it's not just about you kind of sitting here and just like listening, but also really kind of getting involved. So we assume that everyone that has joined us today is here and because they care about the work and they're working towards racial justice in whatever way that they can. And so we're all here to also learn together. So make sure you can be as involved as possible. Next slide. About us, about BRJA. So we were officially founded in 2003. We have our roots in the Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996. And we are a program of Fusion Partnerships Incorporated, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We also provide free open to the public resources like this 13th of the month event. And we also do short take videos on our Instagram. So you can visit our YouTube and Instagram pages to kind of see those regular offerings. We also provide anti-racism and anti-oppression, or as we call it, ARAO, organizational development. So we do this through consulting, executive coaching, assessments, and workshops for organizations both local and national. And if you want to learn more about that work, you can go to bemoreantiracist.org for more information to request a meeting. And we have some other things coming up. So choosing a racial equity consultant, a conversation with BRJA that is happening on Wednesday, January 18th, 2023, from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. It's a participatory conversation. Pull up a virtual seat and join us. Registration is only $20. It's a part of our 20th anniversary celebration. If you want to use your phone, if you will cut your camera on, you can register for this using the QR code here on your screen. And as I mentioned, we are on social media. So social media is where we have a lot of our offerings, so make sure you check that out. We are on YouTube as Baltimore Racial Justice Action. You can, of course, see our past 13th events and other short takes, so please make sure you go there and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're also on Facebook. You'll see a lot about our events there. We're also on Twitter as Be More Anti-Racist and Instagram as Be More Anti-Racist. And we have different events and we do a lot of publicity around events and offerings we have on those social media pages. And if you want to support this work that we do here at BRJA in a financial capacity, you can certainly use the QR code to donate. So this work is really important, as we've seen over the last few years, but it does take money. And so, of course, We really want to make sure that we are offering really up-to-date, inclusive, and really powerful work around anti-racism and anti-oppression. And that can be done if you use the QR code or the link bemoreantiracist.org/donate. And you can donate through PayPal or tick the box. So it's a monthly donation. And next slide. All right. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle because we're about to start our discussion for today, discussing Afrofuturism and the Black Cell, which I'm really, really excited about. So Michelle, you can take it away.
Thank you, Julia. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Dewberry. As Julia said, she and I co-host the 13th of the month events together. And I also have been a part of BRJA probably for about 6 years now. But we're really excited to have you all here for this discussion. I want to talk a little bit about Afrofuturism. Maybe you've heard the term, maybe you haven't. Maybe you kind of have like a loose idea of what you think it might be. Maybe you've associated it with Black Panther, or I've even saw a post recently on social media saying The Wiz was part of Afrofuturism. So don't feel like you have to know what Afrofuturism is to enjoy this discussion. We're actually going to watch a short clip where someone kind of talks about what Afrofuturism is, what it isn't, and just kind of gives like some historical context around the term. But before we do that, we're going to go to the next slide. And I couldn't find one definitive definition of Afrofuturism because I think that the term was coined in the 1990s, and I think people are still kind of grappling with what it is. So there's not like a consensus on the definition of it. But one thing I did found that I thought was useful is that there are many definitions of Afrofuturism. They all have themes of reclamation, Black liberation, and revisioning of the past and predictions of the future through a Black cultural lens in common. So I want us to kind of be thinking about that. I also want us to be thinking about what part Afrofuturism plays in the struggle towards Black liberation. Is it necessary? Is it useful? Just kind of be thinking of some of those thoughts as we go through this discussion around Afrofuturism, and then having our wonderful discussion with Dr. Wendy Shaia, who's here with us tonight to talk about her book, The Black Cell, which takes place in Baltimore, but has Afrofuturism elements infused into her storytelling. Before we jump into discussing The Black Cell with Dr. Wendy Shaia, I just want to give a little bit of background about who she is. Wendy has worked in social services and government organizations. She's currently a faculty member at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and the executive director of the Social Work Community Outreach Services, SWACOS, a community-facing agency working across Baltimore and Maryland to reduce the effects of poverty and structural oppression in communities. Wendy writes and teaches extensively on racism and developed the SHARP framework for providing services to people who've experienced poverty and oppression. This framework is now being adopted by several service providers around the nation. So we're really excited to have her with us and discussing her new book. Before we jump into the book, Wendy, I would like for you to tell us a little bit more about your background, your childhood, where you come from, and also how that kind of shapes who you are as a writer.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Michelle. So first of all, I learned so much from that video. I'm going to have to go back and watch it again. So much good stuff there. But I am, I want to say that I am a mother, I am a wife. Those are my identities really around my family, and my ancestry are really an important part of who I am. My family's from Jamaica, West Indies. So I am actually an immigrant. I came here as a teenager. And, I moved to New York, to Queens, New York. And then, lived there for a while and eventually went to college. And at some point in my 30s, I moved to Maryland. It was a great move, and so I have worked in a lot of places. I have worked in government and nonprofits. I've worked in nonprofits for over 30 years. So a lot of nonprofit work. And, I've been really interested in how we work with people through nonprofits and thought a lot about being part of the nonprofit industrial complex. It's something that I think about all the time. We have to sort of recognize where we sit and, what we're complicit in. And so that's something I think about a lot. And at the same time, I do believe that there's a lot of amazing work being done out there. And so there's this balance of like, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? It changes hour by hour, Michelle, I will tell you that. So that's a little bit about me. We have a blended family with 5 grown adults ranging from 35 to 19. So, we have a very busy, active life, lots going on. My children, 3 of them are in school right now, 1 at Morgan, 1 at UMBC. Yeah, and another one out at school in Indiana. So we're busy, and writing is just a way of escape for me. So, at some point I'm sure you'll want to know a little bit about why I write, but it is an escape. I grew up in a family where my mother worked in a library. Oh. And I used to get dropped off at the library after school in Jamaica. And so I spent my hours and hours among the stacks, learning and reading things I didn't understand. But that's when I really developed a love of books. Mm-hmm. And so didn't really know that I would be an author one day, but it's something that I have always loved writing. And so, yeah, this happened quite accidentally. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. So as a child, what kind of books were you kind of drawn to? I love the fact that your mom had you exposed to books at a young age. What kind of books were you initially drawn to as a child?
Well, when I was growing up in Jamaica, we didn't have a lot of books, or at least I was not exposed to a lot of books about Black people. At that time, so let me say 2 things. There's this sort of like our sort of indigenous sort of cultural sort of storytelling, which is more of an oral tradition. And then there were the books we had in the library, which are like, your Nancy Drew and your Hardy Boys and things like that. And so I spent a lot of time reading those books and trying to figure out how those things related to my day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. But in the evenings, we were on the veranda and my grandmother was telling Anansi stories. And that really fit more with who I was and understanding that there was ancestry that spoke to me from those Anansi stories. And Anansi stories are used to teach children both good things and bad things. And so I found myself always trying to balance this sort of like this white life, Dick and Jane and Spot the dog, versus the Anansi stories and those stories that my mother used to tell me.
Thank you for sharing that, Wendy. It makes me think about how sometimes our culture is not always written down, right? But it's passed down orally, and how important oral histories can be, that our histories and our culture doesn't have to be validated, right? Because it's not written down. So thank you for Yeah. So I want to know where this story came from. Was it something that was like, I know some people say, oh, I had this story percolating for years and I finally put it on paper. I would love to hear more about that process of where the story came from and how it developed.
Well, I wrote down when I was listening to that, watching the video you played, I wrote down that Afrofuturism is often creating art out of pain and loss. And I think that's where the story came from. I mean, I when Freddie Gray was killed, I had so much grief, and it was strange because I had this strange phenomenon happening where when I would see the videos of him being dragged, somehow the face of one of my children was superimposed on him, and it was just so personal. It was so real. It hit me very hard, and we look for ways to deal with grief, right? We can turn it in and where it will eventually kill us, or we can turn it out in something. It can be anger, it can be art. There are lots of ways in turning it out. And one day I just started writing. I was just trying to think about what would it look like if this weren't happening to us, or what would it look like if we could fight back? What would that look like? And I remember I started writing in 2015, and then I stopped because we were doing a lot of work around anti-racism. And then when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, I started thinking about the book again. And I had just gone to Jamaica at the beginning of 2020 to visit my 90-year-old aunt, who has since is now an ancestor. And when I was there, I was sitting with the lady who takes care of her. And she was asking me a lot of questions. You know, you live in America, so I want to know. It's like the streets are paved with gold there, right? And she said to me, this lady said to me, I just don't understand. Why don't you all just rise up and fight back? Why don't you fight back? And I remember saying to her that, well, it's far more complicated than that. That is a very simplified version of a way of thinking. But then I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, you know, the difference between the way this woman was raised and the way my children were raised in this country is that going to school in Jamaica, you learn all about enslavement. You learn all about the slave revolts, and you learn all about that. And of course, all of these things happen here too, but our children aren't taught about those in school. And so for many of us, they're not front of mind, right? And so she said that to me, and I came back and I started thinking about it, and I said, you know, what would it look like? How could this look? And so when Afrofuturism is really envisioning a future that has not happened, or that's based on a history that isn't actually, you know, real, maybe I lost myself in a little bit of fantasy for survival. But I started writing, and I just wrote and wrote, and within 4 months, this whole book poured out.
Wow. I enjoyed what you had to say about imagining if we could fight back. And people are fighting back. I want to
Yes.
say that
Yes,
Black
absolutely.
people have been rebelling and fighting back.
Absolutely. We wouldn't still be alive.
Yes, since we first arrived here
Right.
in this country, in whatever ways they could, by breaking tools, whatever they could think of
Whatever.
to do. They've always been pushing back. So I don't want us to think that Black people haven't been doing that. But it doesn't look like a full out war, right? And so I guess if we could talk a little bit about, like, how much did you know about Afrofuturism before you wrote the book? Did you know when you started it that you wanted to incorporate Afrofuturism? No, okay. If you could talk.
No, it was completely accidental. No, really.
Okay.
I mean, it was really Wendy sitting down and saying, what would it look like? I didn't even think of the term Afrofuturism at the time. I didn't think about it till after I had written the book. And I think somewhere people started talking to me about speculative fiction. Of course, you know, Afrofuturism can fall into the larger genre of speculative fiction. And I thought, oh, okay, so this is speculative fiction. Okay, fine. And it wasn't until later on that I started to think, but this is really Afrofuturism, because I'm really writing about what the future could look like. I used to think, though, that Afrofuturism was all about science fiction. And I learned as the video showed that it's much bigger than that. Now, I will say, I am writing a sequel to the book, and it's got a lot more. I would say it's got a lot more science fiction in it than this first book did. And part of that is just me becoming comfortable with the genre, and you know, reading Octavia Butler, and just sort of understanding that there were lots of people on that video that I don't know, so I'm going to go back and look at those books. But just understanding that there's this wider group of people that are writing in this genre was just eye-opening to me, but I kind of fell into it accidentally.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Because you would think that, you know, that would be something that was kind of at the forefront of your mind while writing. So it's interesting to hear.
Well, can I just say something about that? So because you know, a lot of writers you talk about writers who sort of think very hard and think about what they're doing and they plan it. So there are sort of two schools of thought about writing. There's sort of the planful writer, and there's the write by the seat of your pants. I'm a write by the seat of your pants writer. Like, I don't know what's going to come off my computer until it happens. So I'll sit down and I will start typing, and then it happens. So I am very often as surprised as the reader.
Yeah. I've heard some writers say that, you know, I thought the story was going to go this way. I'm like, well, you're the author. That's
all the time.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear about the process of creativity. Yeah. Speaking of the process of creativity, I'm curious about why the story is based in Baltimore. Do you think the story could take place in another city? Just curious on your thoughts on that.
it really could take place in any city, especially where there are Black people. I think somewhere again, this was not a conscious thought. I realized afterwards. If Baltimore was the birthplace of racialized housing covenants, somehow in my mind, it made sense for it to be the birthplace of the national resistance.
Mm.
Does that make sense? I don't know, but it seemed fitting to me. The rest of the country followed Baltimore's redlining rules, right? And so we pushed that out into the rest of the country. So why not push out the national resistance too? It made sense.
Mm.
Yeah.
If it were set in a different city, what things do you think, and I love that explanation, I love that idea and concept. Do you think that there would be things about the story you would have to drastically change, or do you think it would kind of
I think there would be a different flavor. Baltimore has its own flavor. I mean, that's one of the reasons I love Baltimore, and that's one of the reasons it made sense to have this book. Baltimore is a character in the book.
Mhm.
It's not just a setting there, and of course I am not a Baltimorean. This is a city that I love. And so some of this I was guessing at, like, well, I wonder what it would have been like to have been, Corey's one of the characters in the book in Tasia, and grow up in West Baltimore and really experience many of those struggles. So it could have been in other cities, but I do think there would have been slightly different flavors. But overall, I think the story of the resistance would probably be pretty similar.
Hmm. Thank you for that. And Wendy, what is it that when you were writing the book, what do you feel like some of the main messages are that you wanted your readers to come away with?
Oh, so much. I think one of the messages is that our history is important.
Mm.
We've got to know our history, and I am still learning so much history, right? Because I came here as a teenager, and so I missed those early history classes of American history. I missed all of it. I know. Well, not it wasn't the full history, right? And so I feel like I've been in this catch-up mode of trying to learn, and as I learn more and more of our history in this country, as Black people, it makes me think about it feeds more into the story of the future, right? Because I feel like it's very hard to envision a future without understanding where we came from, without understanding what has contributed to where we are now. It's part of the journey, right? So part of the journey is looking back and seeing where we came from and understanding that. And of course, that is a big part of our culture and our ancestry, right? No matter where we come from in the diaspora, right? And then using that information to chart the path forward. So I think understanding history is absolutely critical. I wanted to sort of share this idea that there is enough to go around. There's enough. We are enough. We don't have to go out looking to white society for our answers, for our validation. We are enough, and we have enough. And the idea of community was so big to me, because I feel as though in many ways Black culture is constantly pressing against this individualism of white America, and in some ways we are constantly fighting that focus on how do you climb your way to the top. Well, we don't have to climb our way to the top if we're helping each other. Put your foot here, right? We don't have to do that. And so I wanted to show what it could look like if we were not thinking about each of our individual needs, but that we were thinking about what do we need as community? What would it look like if everybody had what they needed to eat? What would it look like if everybody had somewhere to live? We really could do that. I really believe we could do that. It just will take a different will and a different way of thinking about the world. So community, history, and this sort of moving away from this idea that everything is scarce and that we have to scramble for resources, that there is enough and that we are enough. I think the biggest messages that and then the other, there's one other thing. I think the other thing that is important to me in this book is the intergenerational nature of the characters. That, you know, one of the main characters is a 90-year-old woman, and she, in some ways, she is sort of like a reincarnation of one of the Jamaican national heroes. Her name is Nanny of the Maroons. And you know, what I looked at a picture of Nanny on the Jamaica dollar bill. There's a picture of her with her head wrapped, and I really sort of created this woman Ramla after her, with the understanding that we need all the generations at the table, right? Because sometimes we like to talk about, you know, it's all about the young people, and the young people are going to do everything. The young people have a lot of energy and creativity, but they don't have the experience.
Right.
And so we need the combination of the experience and the wisdom of our elders and the creativity and energy of our younger people. That's how we have a full resistance movement. It can't happen if any piece of that is missing.
Thank you. I love this message of intergenerational power. I think that, you know, living in the United States, there's so much pressure, right, to operate as an individual, to live as an individual. You know, a lot of people don't even live multi-generationally, and a lot of people don't know that this is a very current concept in human history. So I love that you brought that out and highlighted that in your book.
Wow.
Wendy, is there any last thoughts that you want to leave with the audience about your book, that this gift that you've given to us? Any last like threads or anything else that you want to add to the discussion?
Well, you know, one of an area of feedback that I get a lot is that the book didn't wrap up nicely. You know, there wasn't this nice bow at the end. And so first of all, I had enough in my head for 3 books. It's a really long book. I had to exit at some point, but the story wasn't finished, right? Wow. So I got to the place where they were like, my publisher was like, this book can't be any longer. Like, this book has got to end. It's 400 pages. Like, this book has got to stop. Right. But I also think that those of us who understand the history of racism and white supremacy, we know it's never going to get tied up in a nice bow. Right? We know that we'll get to the end of the story, and it's a period. It's a comma. It's not a period. You know, it is because the story is going to continue. We know that it's a constant scaffolding of we make some progress, we fall back a little, we go up, we make some more progress, we fall back. You know, that's the reality of this work. And so it felt disingenuous to me to wrap it all up in a nice bow. Now, could I have perhaps made it a little bit more satisfying for people? I probably could have, but I decided not to. I decided that I wanted people to walk away thinking about what could come after the comma, what's coming. And in some ways, with the hope that people make up the rest of the story for themselves. Yeah. Like, what would it be for you? What would happen if you were a member of the Black Cell or a member of La Lucha or one of the white allies who was, you know, working in the police force or behind the scenes? What would be the next step for you? What comes next? So we'll see.
No, I like that. Thank you. At this time, I'm going to open the floor to others who might have questions, comments, things you might want to ask Wendy about the book, questions or comments that you want to make about Afrofuturism. So the floor is now open.
I'm going to just speak real quick because I feel like other people definitely have a lot of questions. For one, congrats, Wendy. This is so wild because Wendy, I've known Wendy for a very long time. And, you know, writing a book is not an easy feat. So congratulations. I am both fearful and also inspired. My question, I think, really is about like that kind of process. So what inspires you, I think, as an author, especially talking about writing a second book? How do you keep, I think, that momentum going? I think it's something. And the kind of a second part of that question is, what have you learned as a writer, like writing through this whole process? And how does that connect to, I think, the work that you do, with like, fighting oppression and, being a social worker? So how does this all kind of like fit and work together, if that makes sense?
So the writing process, I'll tackle, and then Julie, if I forget the second part of the question, remind me. The writing process was, I don't even really know how to describe it, because it was almost like jumping into a pool and being completely submerged. Now, I wrote this book was written right, in 2020, right as we were in the pandemic. So I wasn't going anywhere in the evenings. I wasn't going anywhere on the weekends. And at the same time, we were sort of faced with all this George Floyd and all of these, this very visible, like in your face murders. And I felt like I was drowning in the pool. And at some points, this writing was swimming, so it's sort of like helping me to figure out, how do I keep moving? How do I not suffocate under the grief of all of this? And so it was more just kind of like an immersion. I found myself thinking about the characters. I would sit and eat dinner with them. I mean, they were always with me. They became very real people to me. And of course, these characters are all composites of people I know. I didn't make any of this up, right? Every single person in there is, I pulled a little piece from this person or from this experience or from that experience. And I think at the same time, I was also, how you can go through grief in waves. And so like you can grieve something, and then 20 years later, you start grieving it again. This happens to me with the death of my mother. She died 30 years ago. And then I have these, like every 10 years or so, I have this new wave of grief. And I was for some reason, the police killings kept bringing up to me, my family fostered a young boy. His name was Corey. When I was in my early 20s, and Corey was murdered on the street. And and for some reason, all of the killings just kept sort of bringing him back to me for some reason. He was there, he was present, he was like next to me all the time. And so I just wrote about him in a way that sort of reimagined what his life would be had he lived, right? And so that was the process. And I'm sort of writing, and my family will come along and like push a plate in front of me, or maybe a cup, so I was really immersed in that. What was the second part of your question?
The second part of the question was, like, I think especially as you're going into writing a sequel, but what have you learned about yourself as like a writer? And like going through this process the first time, and now kind of like learning more information, and then how does that inspire, I think, the work that you do outside of being a writer? Because you got a packed schedule. I'll be honest, it's shocked to even get Wendy on here, because Wendy be moving. So I think just how does that all fit, and then like what have you learned about yourself through this process? Because writing it is, I think, a kind of a pouring out of a part and pieces of you. And it can be a lot emotionally. And just like, what have you learned about yourself through this process?
I think my work is very hard in many ways. It is all consuming. And it's very often focused on all the negative things, right? It's the kids that have been shot, this year, and the poverty we're seeing, and all the people who are unhoused. And I feel like I take that stuff to bed with me, like I can't let it go. And maybe I should be better at releasing those things. But when it comes to people, it's hard for me. And so what I've learned is that this writing gives me an out, right? So like I am overwhelmed with all the things that are happening in the world right now. And then I can go and write about, Corey, confronting, his oppressor in a way that I can't right now, that I don't get to. I can go write about Tasia, this young mother who I just wanted to share her story, because so many people think, a young single mom, they have this whole narrative about her, and it's not the right narrative for most of the people I know who have found themselves in that situation. So I wanted to write about her finding herself and seeing her power and walking in her power. It is a good balance to my day-to-day work. so that when I come home at the end of the day and I turn off my computer and I feel overwhelmed. I cry a lot around my work. I mean, a lot of people don't know that. There are lots of days where I have to, I get off a Zoom meeting, I go shed some tears, and I get myself back together and get back on, right? It gives me an out. And so it's in some ways, I think writing is life-saving.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful. I think struggling, especially in this type of work, finding that balance is always, it's an art and it takes time, but I think that's a really beautiful notion of just, it allows you that space. So thank you for sharing that and your work with us. I'm gonna cry it up now.
Thank you, Julia. Those are great questions. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to ask Wendy about her book or about Afrofuturism or just her work in general?
I feel like I saw some things in the chat that were there questions?
I don't know if there were any questions.
Okay, mostly comments. Okay.
I think it was more statements.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I think someone did say they wanted to hear more about your characters. I'm trying to figure out how to scroll up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so there are 4 main characters in my book. And by the way, I do know that that's a lot of main characters. I really do understand that it's kind of a big production. And again, didn't set out to write that, but I really wanted to show the diversity of thought, even in Black culture, right? Because sometimes, people are tempted to think that we all think the same way, that we're a monolith. And no, there are as many different ways of thinking as there are people. And so it didn't seem to me that I could really tell all those storylines with just 1 or 2 characters. So there are 4 main characters, and then there was a bunch of other people. So Corey is a young man who's about 23 years old, and he feels like, he's had a difficult time. He grew up in a West Baltimore community where, it's the community where people take care of each other and take care of their children. And, he grew up around, Miss So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so. And we go to each other's houses and we live communally. But then his mother ends up having an experience that is very common in many schools, which is where Corey goes to school. He's just lost a family member, so he is deep in thought in his grief. And his white teacher, just comes at him hard, and he kind of flies out of the school. And his mother goes up there to say, "What is going on?" And of course, we Black women are very often characterized as angry and dangerous just when we show any emotion at all. And she ends up being sent to jail just for poking the teacher in the chest. She gets sent to jail for assault. And that's sort of like the spiral for Corey and his family. And he ends up having an experience with the police where he is stopped on the street and stripped down and basically sexually assaulted on the street. Now, so a lot of this stuff comes out of the consent decree, right? Because this is stuff that's happening for real on Baltimore streets. Was happening, is still happening. And I wanted to show that. But Corey, the police break him down. And then the cell builds him back up. He gets together with these people who are in this Black cell, and he begins to see that, God, Black people can have power. Wow, we can do things. And he's never seen that before. And watching him blossom, I'm watching him blossom, was a real joy to me. And then there was another character, Tasia, who's a young mother, and I talked a little bit about her. And she really came into her own. She found herself in the cell. She found purpose. And she found people to love her and care for her and help her with her young daughter, which is really this sort of community spirit that I'm talking about. And then there's another woman, Lisa. Of course, all of my main characters are Black. I was very clear in my own mind that there would be no white point of views in this book and that there'd be no white saviors. And let me tell you, if this book ever gets made into a movie, I don't know how I'm going to get that put into the contract, but there can be no white saviors in this book. We have to save ourselves, right? But Lisa is, middle class, grew up in, Westchester, New York, and has had a good life, and really looks down on so many Black people. She sees herself as superior, and she doesn't see herself because she's wealthy. She doesn't think that she's going to be impacted by race, and she soon finds out that racism doesn't care how much money you have. And then the final character is Donovan. He's one of my own people. He's Jamaican. You know, I often say that America's biggest export across the Black diaspora is racism, is anti-Black racism. And so we picked that up in Jamaica just from watching television and reading the news. And so Donovan comes with all of that, his anger. I wanted to tell the story of immigrants coming here and leaving their children behind at home to come and make a better life. And then when those children come over, they're very angry. And that is a common story, very, very common story. But it's not something we hear a lot when we think of, when we talk about Black immigrants coming to this country. So he comes with all his anger and his anti-Blackness, which really is about his self-hatred, you know, and he has to work through that. And I'm not going to give any spoilers because I've been accused of spoiling, you know, in these conversations. So I won't give any spoilers. But Donovan, a lot of people really dislike him. But he is important to the story because it is important to show that even if everybody is not on the side of Black liberation, everybody that's Black still deserves to be liberated. Mm-hmm. How do we liberate the people who don't know they need liberation? How do we help them see that they need liberation? And even when they're in the process of tearing down the movement, they still deserve liberation. What does that look like? And what kind of compassion do we need to have as a people to be able to pull those folks into the fold? Question I asked myself. I haven't answered it yet, though.
Yeah, and those really interesting questions. Thank you, Wendy. We do have a couple questions. Ebony, did you want to share your question? Do you want me to read it?
Ebony.
I don't want to put you on the spot. I'll read it. Ebony's question is it your goal as the writer to motivate readers to harness their collective power similar to the characters?
Absolutely. I mean, even if for some people it is just the first time of seeing themselves in that light, right? Even if it's just the first time of seeing that everybody has a role to play in this resistance. Everybody has a role. There can be nobody who's left out. And I don't care about your level of education. I don't care about your background. I don't care if you're sitting in prison. I don't care whether you're struggling with substance use. I don't care who you are. If you are Black, there is a place for you in this Black liberation movement. So yeah, I wanted people to have a discussion. I just wanted to start a conversation. Now, I didn't know that this was going to ruffle some feathers. And let me tell you, has this ruffled some feathers? I have gotten some nasty messages on social media. I mean, to the point where my husband's like, okay, what are we going to do about this? You know, and so, but I feel like if you're not stirring things up, maybe you're just kind of helping things stay the same. So yeah, I want to have that conversation. I want to have that conversation with young people who may not really be sort of conversing on the history that I'm talking about. I've had a lot of young people say to me, Miss Wendy, I didn't know that. I learned something reading that book. That's success for me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have another question, Anthony. Did you want to read your question or say your question to Wendy, or do you want me to read it?
You got it, Michelle.
Anthony's question says, speaking of a movie, do you have actors in mind to play any or all of your characters? Have you thought about that?
People ask me that all the time. And I could tell you, the only person that I have thought about, I've been thinking about it. I've been watching movies and saying, well, who would it be? Do you know Lorraine Toussaint? She plays Aunt Vi in Queen Sugar, I think.
Oh, okay. Yes. I know who she is.
I thought of her as Ramla. You know, I think of somebody who is sort of who's got, you know, very dignified and stately. But apart from that, I can't think of who else. I would love some ideas. I mean, people ask me this question all the time. So if y'all want to like email me with some ideas after you've read the book, I would really appreciate that. I would love that.
That was a great question. Any other questions that we have for Wendy about the book, about her life in general, about Afrofuturism?
So I had a quick question. This is Becky.
Yeah, I do too. Go ahead, Becky.
Hi, I'm thinking about Adar's comment about reading the book 6 times, which is amazing. And it's making me think about how many times you've spoken about this book that I know of, which is probably not even a sliver of what you've done that I don't know of. And so I'm just wondering, like, when you talk about the book, does your analysis of your own writing evolve over those conversations? Or do you feel like as a writer, like you kind of set that from like when you're in it, when you're in the writing, and then that allows you to speak about it? Can you talk a little bit about that process of like
It
deepening your
evolves.
own?
It evolves, Becky, because I am evolving, right? I am growing. And as I learn and grow, I look back on my characters. Sometimes I see things that I didn't see before. And I think, I didn't realize I put that in that book, in this book. I didn't even realize, or I wasn't thinking consciously about this, but now I can see how it aligns with this experience I'm having. So yeah, it evolves. I continue to experience the characters as new and fresh. And every time I talk about it, and every time I go back and do a reading, I read a little section of it, I see something, I'm like, oh, I don't think I noticed that before. Because remember, I'm just writing, like I'm writing, I've read it so many times, and yet I continue to be surprised when I think about what I've written. So to me, these characters are living and breathing, and they're not just stagnant on a page. So they grow, I grow.
Thank you. Adar, you had a question?
So I really, I loved everything that you've said, Wendy. Thank you so much. I also loved how how two of your characters really highlighted the pitfalls of looking at success from just an economic lens, and receiving kudos and bouquets for doing that, and then being slapped down and reminded that they actually were Black in America, right? And that their income would not protect them. Also, I really appreciated how the book touched on Donovan and this whole idea of elevated Black. Right, you and I've talked about this before. This thing about some Black immigrants coming over and not being aware of, the fact that the very reason that they can come and that they can have any type of opportunity was because of the blood, sweat, and tears of those whose ancestors landed here in the Ma'afa, and the ways in which people want to assimilate into whiteness, because as we know, white supremacy is the greatest export. The way in which you did that, a way that was not preachy, but was poignant and pointed enough to give people something to think about. And I want to know whether you had those two goals in mind when you did it, or whether that was just the way in which the story and the characters evolved, or whether you did that because of your own background, that experience.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you didn't think it was preachy, because I have certainly gotten that feedback, mostly from white readers. I've gotten that feedback from some white readers, and I have gotten that feedback from Black readers who are in colonized countries, who are outside of this country. So it's an interesting perspective. I've just kind of been watching who says that. So some people do think it's very preachy. I wanted to share a perspective. As I learned history, I wanted to put it into a real life setting, so that you can find the history in there, but you're finding it through something that's contemporary. So that was kind of my thinking. But my own experience plays really big in this. I mean, you will see that Jamaican culture is a pretty big part of this book. I use a lot of patois. I use some terms. Because that's who I am, right? I am Jamaican. I that is so much a part of me. But I also feel like I sit in this place where I code switch between being African Caribbean and African American, right? And so I wanted to show all the parts of who I am. And then the reality that when we come here as immigrants, we sort of have to figure out how we make our way as we come from this colonized place, because Black countries even though we are Black countries, even in Jamaica we're Black, we are very British. Like we are very colonized. That is still so much a part of our psyche. And I wanted to show that in a way that help people to understand that there are so many different ways of showing up Black in this world and in this country. And I wanted to really highlight, partially as a reminder for myself, because when I came to this country, I came with all of that anti-Blackness. A lot of people don't, find that difficult to believe. I came with all of that, and I had to root that out of myself and continue to, right? It's an ongoing process. But I wanted to show what Donovan was like and how much that's a part. There are so many of us walking around with all of that. Yeah, so it's part of my story. Yeah, part of who I am.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And of course, Adar has been really instrumental. Adar was my reader. He read a lot of it and really gave me lots of feedback. And yeah, I do feel as though much of this has been a community effort. I really feel as though I've gotten a lot of help. I've gotten a lot of feedback and just kind of, people teaching me things about history that I found myself putting in the book. So in some ways, I see this as, I don't think I could have written this book by myself.
Just want to share quickly, Ebony had a comment about people saying that the book seemed preachy. She said sometimes when a message is new and jarring, people loop that in with words like preachy. So I just want to share.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. One of my reviews said, nothing in this book was new. I knew all of this already. And so I just didn't see the point of it. And I thought, well, good for you. I mean, like you knew it. That's wonderful. You didn't need to read the book. And the other thing is I'm really clear and people have taken issue with this on the back of the book where I say, I've written this book for Black people and others who are committed to Black liberation. If you're not committed to Black liberation, it's not the book for you. Don't read it. Don't read it. Right? You're not gonna like it.
Right. And we have a question from Dottie. Dottie says, the brilliant detail and strategy of the Black Cell made me feel like it was the first volume of a multi-volume handbook on Black liberation. How were you able to dig that deep into the specifics of planning and carrying out the steps in the movement work?
Oh, that's a good question, Dottie. In some ways, I tried to imagine what the Black Panthers would look like in 2022. Like what would that be? What would that be? What would it look like if we know the Black Panthers were feeding people and taking care of their community and learning the law and knowing how to protect ourselves. And so it was really, for me, an evolution of all that I learned about the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, and really thinking about what it might look like. What is a sort of updated version of that? And so I did a lot of research on things like guns. I had to learn about all different parts, and my husband helped me with that a lot. Just make sure I don't write anything that doesn't make sense, okay? I had to learn about things like accounting, because there's all this money. I don't want to tell everything, but there's a lot of money stuff that's figured out. And I had to learn. I mean, I did a lot of research. And so there's just as much time spent researching as there is writing in this book, because I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything. So yeah, the detail was important to me, because so the other part of the way I write is that I am seeing what I'm writing. So I'm seeing, it's like watching a movie. So I'm seeing it, hearing, smelling, tasting. And I'm just typing what I'm seeing. So in some ways, the scene is in front of me, and I'm not really making anything up. I'm just writing down what I'm experiencing. And so all those details just showed up. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. We have another question from Richard. He says, wow, no white saviors in your book and in this existential paradigm, Afrofuturism. Please say a little bit more about this, especially since we have been programmed to believe that we can't save ourselves, and that not only is somebody coming to save us, but they must come to save us.
Yeah, I have such a problem with that. This is probably not going to be a popular comment, but even in Black Panther, there was a white savior. And I just thought white people can be adjacent to us, supporting us, but they can't save us. and this, it's so built into what we read and what we see on the screen, this idea that we can't do it alone, but we really can. And I just wanted to sort of chart a path to what it might look like if we were able to do it. I mean, I write about a concept that my family uses, which is like a community wealth building. In Jamaica, we call it partner or susu. It's putting your money together and figuring out how to create what you want to create with it. Well, we're doing that. People are doing that all over the world, and people are doing that here in this country. So we really could build our own economy, and we really could figure out how to do everything we need ourselves. And so I didn't see the need for a white savior. I didn't see any usefulness for that person. We're gonna go save some white people. We're very good at doing that, but let's flip it a little bit, right?
Thank you. Yeah, when you were talking, Wendy, about that we don't need any help saving ourselves, I was thinking about, we lived for millennia without any help. We're,
Right.
Black people were doing just fine for millennia.
In fact, we were doing more than fine. We were doing
More than
really
fine. Kingdoms, yes, before Europeans showed up. So
that's right. That's right. We need to remember.
Yes, for sure. Did someone else have a question?
I do hear something.
I think there was just someone that wasn't on mute. All right. I'm just gonna put one more last call out for any more questions or comments, but this has been a very beautiful, fruitful conversation. But anyone else have questions they want to ask?
I have a comment.
Sure.
So the sign of any good book for me is when I get lost in the characters and when I want to know more about the characters. So I just wanted to point out that there is more about some characters in some short stories Wendy's written. So for anybody who gets hooked like that, like I do, you can go on a website and read some short stories.
Oh,
like
that's
there's more subplots. We don't have to wait for the second book.
That's a good point, Gail. And a lot of those short stories are all in the second book, because in the second book, I go back to the roots of the Black cell, go back to 1935 when Ramla first got her call from the ancestors, and when she first got her gifts, because she has all of these gifts of being able to divine things and speak to the ancestors. So the second book, I go back all the way back to the beginning and sort of chart the whole course of the making up of the cell. And so I do that in the form of short stories. There's a short story about each of the characters, and each of those short stories covers an event in history. So, the Harlem riots in the 30s and 40s, the killing of Emmett Till, the move in Philadelphia, dropped the bomb on the whole Hurricane Katrina and this absolute neglect of Black people. So each story sort of happens at a time in history. Rodney King happens at a time in history and really shows how each of those events sort of made the cell stronger and brought people into the cell. So yeah, there's a bunch of shorts. So it'll be interesting to see if people like that format, because it's a little different. But I feel like, again, we have to go back to our history to be able to chart the path forward. So yes, there are short stories, that you can get that have been published. Yeah.
We have another question from, I don't want to mess up the pronunciation of her name, Nyasha. Her question is,
Hello.
I said it right? Okay. Rather than one sequel, could you see this becoming a series like that of Nancy Drew?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know when the story is going to be finished, right? So I am as much guessing as everybody else. But yeah, I mean, I have a sense of where the story can go. However, I don't know if it'll go there. But in my mind, yeah, I could see that. It'll be interesting to see how the sequel is received, and whether people want to read more. So, it's yet to be determined. Initially, I thought this would be a 3-book series, but it looks very different from when I first thought about it. So I have no idea how many books it'll be.
Amazing.
Enough for a really good Netflix series.
Yes.
Multiple seasons.
So you're still writing the second book? Is that what you still, okay.
Yeah, I'm actually writing 2 books right now. I'm writing that secret, and I'm very honored to have been asked to write the memoir for Brother Ron Chisholm, who is the co-founder of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. He's 82 years old. He's an elder I really respect, and I am writing his memoir about how he came to be an organizer and the principles that he uses for organizing. So I 2 books, and I have a full-time job and I have a family. So I don't know how this is going to work. It should be interesting.
Wow. Well, we would love to have you back to talk about both of those amazing projects. Thank you so much for your time today, for talking more about your book and just bringing it more to life for our audience. Wendy, would you like to share any links where people can purchase your book? I know we did share on our social media the link for, it was the first 5 chapters, I believe, that people could read, but
it's I didn't pull
share
up
any information.
the link. I can pull up the link. It's available on Amazon and BookBaby, and of course it is available on Audible because I did the audiobook and I read it myself.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I read it, and my sons wrote a rap song to go with the book, and there are little pieces of that rap song at the beginning of each chapter. So what I said has been a community, it's been a community.
I love it.
Yeah. So it's available on Amazon. It's available in a lot of places actually. If you just type into Google the Black Cell, it'll come up in a lot of places.
And I think it's at Goodreads here in Baltimore, right?
It's at
not Goodreads.
It's at Busboys and Poets has it. They have a lot of them, and I am not sure where else there are physical copies. But I know Busboys and Poets had several copies.
Okay, cool.
So we're trying to get it in other places. This is a whole learning experience for me about how to get your books on the shelves and all. So like there is somebody who helps me, a wonderful woman by the name of Stacey Harris. And I think she's on it, but and she helps me because this has been quite a learning curve. So yeah.
Good. So for those of you who don't have a copy, make sure you get one. Make sure you read it, because this is a great book and it takes place here in Baltimore. So make sure you do that. And
Michelle, I'm sorry. Can I just interrupt real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I can't promise Dr. Shaia. Wendy, I can't promise you I'm going to read the book 6 times like my dear friend. I will read it 3 times though, because you're singing my song. This is a powerful, powerful conversation. And it really we need to hear more from you, and all of us need to read your book because you are threatening the status quo. This is an introduction, not an introduction because you're right. I've been hearing about Afrofuturism. Dr. Maxie Collier, who was the first Black health commissioner in Baltimore City, talked about it in his book, Phoenix Arising, back in 1990. So if you ever get a copy of that book, just check that out. But many, many thanks to you, my sister, for this powerful, powerful, powerful book, and for this webinar, because again, it's lifting up, a important paradigm that we really need to examine and need to adopt if we're going to win. And I know we can, and I think all of us believe we can, but we're facing a status quo in systems that, systems, budgets, policies, and practices that fight against that. So again, I'm not going to say more, but thank you so much. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book. It's always a fresh and new experience for me to talk about the book. I'm never quite sure how that will go. So thank you so much. And thanks for making it so easy.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to put the slide back up with our social media. So invite you all to follow us on social media. We will have a recording on our YouTube page of this discussion. So please share it with others, because this was amazing. So I would love for others that weren't able to join us tonight to get to be able to share in this. So Dana, if we could just get the slide for our social media real quick. So you all can follow us on Facebook and on YouTube. We're also on Instagram and Twitter. So thank you all so much for joining us. Do we want to put up Dana real quick for donations? We are a small nonprofit and we appreciate anything that folks are willing to give, and you can give at bemoreantiracist.org, donate through PayPal. And I believe that concludes our evening. Thank you again, Wendy, for joining us. We really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
We're definitely going to have you back about your other two books as well.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.